Okay. If anybody has objection to being recorded, just let me know. We'll turn it off. We try to preserve this. So we've got, so far looks like 15 attendees. I'm going to let Andrew Jennings, since you're the proposer, but you said this is a brainstorming session, I'll let you start it off with a provocative question to kick us off, and then I think we can try and moderate the conversation as we go along. And maybe the goal should be when we get to 11:15 or something, maybe identify 4 or 5 or half a dozen salient points that we think are important around the future of small transit systems post-COVID. Sound like a plan, everybody? All right. Let's go.
And, good morning, everyone. My name is Andrew Jennings. I'm a retired transportation consultant living in Billerica, Massachusetts. Last June, I was appointed as Billerica's representative on the board of directors of the Lowell Regional Transit Authority. That's one of the 15 regional transit authorities outside of the MBTA district in the Boston area. And as I look at what's been happening because of COVID, the property has been pretty well decimated. Ridership is, down greater than 90% from what it was before. And I'm most concerned not with what's going on immediately, but what happens when things return to the new normal. I did put 3 slides together. Is there some way that we can share my screen?
There is, if I can figure it out. Share. There we go. Share. I'm the host.
Let me continue talking while you're looking for that, and just jump in when you think you've got the screen shared, because I can't see what else is going on at the moment on the virtual. Basically all transit systems have a number of challenges that they are facing today. Employment is moving away from transit hubs, or in some cases, like for the transit system, I'm on the board of directors for. There was a need to move out of downtown so that the hub moved away from the employment center. It's at the commuter rail station, which is, let me see here.
So I think you can go, Andrew, I think you can go to the tray on the bottom and click share.
Yeah, it start sharing.
Hi, everyone.
Hey.
And sorry about that. I'm Jerome. I'm the one who proposed this session. Sorry, I guess it got moved. I didn't realize it was moved, bumped up from session 2 to session 1.
Jerome,
yeah, there's a lot of confusion about what session this is, because the 1 and 2 sessions got flipped in this room for some reason. Also, somebody's microphone is not muted, and it's
what created confusion. What created confusion was Jeff read the wrong line. When he was closing the opening session, he read line 2 for this instead of reading line 1. So we're in the future of small transit sessions. It's a brainstorming session versus my end. Jerome, we'll come back to you at 11:30.
Okay.
Yeah, the actual schedule was updated, so if you load it now, it does show BRT as session 1.
Does it?
But I think most people here came for
you are right.
the small
You are
transit.
just uploaded. All right.
Yeah.
So here's Okay, so I'm not going to create confusion. And let me rephrase it. I don't want to create any further confusion. We're going to go with the schedule. The schedule is Jerome. So Jerome, we're going to have a conversation around BRT. All right. So go ahead.
All right. Thanks. Sorry about that. Yeah, I guess it's just the challenge of doing this online. We try to figure it out.
And real time.
Appreciate the flexibility. Yeah, so this session is very casual. I didn't prepare any slides or anything. And I really wish that the title should be more Designing BRT as a Spectrum. But really wanted to have a conversation around the medium of bus rapid transit. And in particular in the United States, there are a lot of different things that are called BRT. And, we have anything from, completely separated busways to, mixed traffic things that are called BRT that are really just what regular bus service should be. So I really just wanted to spend this time to have more of a casual conversation about what are some of the basic elements of BRT that really should be implemented, but also thinking about it in context of each individual city and corridor and what might be appropriate. There is an organization called the Institute for Transportation Development and Policy that has some, standards that they use for BRT grading, so to speak. And I think that can be a helpful framework, but I don't think that it should be the end-all, be-all of how we classify BRT in different situations. But in general, the features for BRT that are considered essential are dedicated lanes where possible, off-board fare payment, level boarding, transit signal priorities / intersection treatments, and then having good amenities at stations. Those come in a wide range of treatments and scalability and how they're implemented. But I really want to just kind of open up the floor to talk about BRT and what people think is essential for BRT and some of the different ways that we can classify and give definition to what makes BRT BRT. So, anyone feel free to take it away.
Well, I think Jerome, that would be helpful if we have maybe what are the profiles to make a quality dedicated lanes, rush hour schedules, timed lights. What are and then who does it?
Yeah, so I think there's a few good examples here in the United States. So one of the more prominent ones that's been implemented for well over a decade now is the Cleveland Health Line. I think in Cleveland, Ohio, it's a good example of center running BRT with good level boarding platforms, off-board fare payment, transit signal priority. Just the design and the configuration of that particular line, I think, works well in its context. Here in Indianapolis, we recently opened the Red Line BRT, which for a significant portion has center running dedicated lanes. And one of the good design choices that we made there was, we put this right in the middle of the street. We took away lanes for cars, which was quite a feat to do, quite a political conversation, quite a conversation with just local citizens about taking away lanes for cars. But that center configuration is really key into putting the rapid in BRT. That really allows minimal disruption. Cars are prohibited from turning across the lane except at intersections. And we actually installed in a lot of protected left turns and U-turns at intersections, which really helped with, which in some cases actually made traffic flow better than it had been previously in certain contexts. So definitely think there's a big push. If you can do a center lane configuration, that's really helpful. The other thing is it allows us to just have to build one station instead of duplicating a stations on both sides for different directions, and that can add some cost to the project as well. You have to duplicate electrical systems and lighting and all those things. If you could have one station for both directions, that can help. So definitely think that's important. But that won't necessarily work everywhere, and it depends on the street that you have, the corridor, the width of the street, and the scope of the project. We've seen a lot of curbside configurations as well. In particular, here in Indianapolis, we have the line that we do have has some curb running portions and mixed traffic as well, and a lot of that was just a result of the particular street we're running down was only a 2-lane road to begin with, and we couldn't widen it or add lanes to it. So different decisions have to be made, for different portions of the corridor. But I definitely think center running lanes are key if you can do that.
All right, does anybody have any other?
I had a question. How long did it take to have those lanes be accepted by the city, or where do those lanes run? What was kind of like the process of implementing?
Yeah, so we had to do a lot of education for both our city officials and the general public. And we really started with, we cited examples of existing BRT lines in different configurations and talked about what the different lane configurations meant. We really tried to sell people on the features that would make this be as rail-like as possible. And so one of the big talking points was, in order to get the rail-like feel, we really need those center lanes, but also that helps with the performance of the line and allows the line to run without worrying about turning movements across the lanes that might result in a curb lane configuration. We had to do a lot of talking about space and geometry, a lot of talking about how our roads are designed. Our roads, we measure the capacity of roads, and people generally look at moving level of service, moving individual vehicles, and we spend a lot of time talking about, well, we're trying to move people, and we're trying to move people efficiently. And so we did a lot of showing, there are many images that show, 40 people on a bus, 40 people on bikes, 40 people in their cars, and kind of the amount of space that they take up. And so we did a lot of that, showing those type of images. And for a lot of people, that was kind of compelling. People had never thought about it that way before. And so when we were able to demonstrate that, we're going to be able to actually move more people in the corridor than we can today, that was really helpful to a lot of people. But also, one of the other aspects we looked at was safety. So the center lane configuration, we actually did some traffic studies and looked at the number of vehicle crashes and incidents with vehicles, and a lot of them in many of our corridors were due to turning movements, cars waiting to turn across oncoming traffic, cars rear-ending each other because people weren't paying attention while our car was waiting to turn across oncoming traffic. And so by putting in these center lanes, we demonstrated that we would be able to help reduce some of those car crashes based on the configuration, and by putting in left turn and U-turn pockets as well at intersections, we also were able to help speed up the traffic flow in a few locations that didn't have signals today. So we used a combination of those talking points, and we had to go through some ordinance changes at the city to get bus lanes approved, and different signage for different intersection types that maybe we didn't currently have. But that's kind of our process that we went through. Any other questions?
I have a quick question. Sure. So, I moved to Boston. I worked at Boston after graduation. And something that is just acutely, it's right there to somebody who's living in Boston, that BRT Creep is real. The Silver Line in Boston is just not BRT, even though it tries to be. I just want to know how you try to avoid that BRT creep when you design your systems.
Yeah, so when, once again, when we were in a lot of the design and conceptual phases, we spent a lot of time studying systems that already existed. And we were trying to look for, we spent a lot of time communicating with other transit agencies that had lines up and running, and trying to understand what worked and what didn't work. And we knew that in order to get the type of premium level service that we wanted, That's when we really kind of decided on the whole center lane conversation. It's definitely a lot of education, once again, that had to happen because, politicians and other elected officials would go maybe do their own research and say, well, why do we have to have this big disruption? Why do we need to take away lanes for cars when it seems like other cities have been able to implement some of these things without dedicated lanes or without the center running lanes? And so once again, it was just really kind of driving home the difference that it would make and the travel time savings over the entire corridor that will result from certain design choices. And some of the monetary savings from different design choices as well, based on the budget that we had. The other thing that really helped is we not only talked about BRT as a transit project, we talked about it as an infrastructure project, and that we were going to be able to make improvements on city streets that otherwise probably would not have been made if it were just left up to the city budget. So in addition to just the transit segment, we did a lot of sidewalk repair. We did drainage improvements. We added in pedestrian signals. We improved curb ramps to ADA standards. And so a lot of those things actually won us some good faith with the public and elected officials because at the end of the day, these projects aren't just transit. They are infrastructure improvement projects as well. And some of those talking points really went over well to help us solidify our design.
Thanks. Great.
Yeah.
So I have a question a little bit about accessibility. With the more station-dependent BRT deployments, does that sacrifice some availability for seniors and people who are used to picking up a bus at every block, or is there an accommodation made for people like that?
That's a great question. So to provide more context for everyone, there are some systems where they'll station spacing. So let's talk about station spacing. General rule of thumb is 1/3 of a mile to 1/2 a mile for spacing for BRT. And so, for many folks, that's mostly doable, but we realize that there are, folks maybe that have mobility issues or seniors that ask them to walk, 1/2 a mile, depending on where they're located, that could be quite a challenge. So some systems have addressed this by continuing to run underlying local service on corridors, and other systems have chosen just to take away the underlying local service altogether. And so it's really a question of, what resources different systems have. Generally, what we've seen is that a lot of systems that keep the underlying local service, the ridership does drop quite a bit because most people just elect to go to the more frequent, faster BRT service. But it really is just contextual on the city and the transit agency. In our case in Indianapolis, we got rid of the underlying local service and just kept the BRT on the streets that BRT runs on. We have several local routes that, of course, cross the line, and there are many transfer opportunities. But definitely, that was a decision that we had to spend a lot of time, talking it out with the community, talking out with elected officials about, people being able to have access. Because, it's great to have better improvements in the corridor, but also a lot of people don't live directly on the corridor. And so people have to walk to the stations and come off of side streets. And if there aren't sidewalks or the sidewalks are in horrible condition, that creates even more issues. One thing that I think is important, and you could say this for a regular local bus, amenities at stops are huge, but especially for a lot of people with mobility issues, some people are willing to walk to a stop, but when they get to that stop, if they have to stand up, that really makes a difference. So if they're able to sit down once they get to where they're going, that can really be very helpful to people as well that maybe have challenges with mobility. But there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. So basically, either you keep underlying local service to provide that block by block or every 2 block service, or you cut it out completely. So I guess the other thing that I wanted to talk about was transit signal priority. there are different kind of gradients of transit signal priority. And there's sort of signal preemption and kind of variable priority. So signal preemption is sort of what maybe some locations with EMS, fire, police services, they have the ability to actually just override traffic lights and completely change them to green to allow them to get through. And that exists in a few locations on transit lines. You see these more on some light rail lines in particular. And then there's priority, gradients of priority. And in our case, we have a combination of preemption at certain intersections and priority at others. And the difference is that priority, what it does is it takes time away from the cross-street intersection, if there's time to take away from the light cycle or the pedestrian cycle. So that means that sometimes we don't always get priority because there's no time left to take away. But it's really something to consider when designing a system or thinking about implementing a system, what level of transit signal priority that you need. And it may not be the same corridor wide. It's going to be contextual depending on the part of the line, the density of the line, the uses around that different parts of the line, but definitely a conversation to have with the city. In a lot of cases, the transit agency doesn't control the traffic lights. That's more of a city department of transportation or public works. And so it's really good to have to solidify that relationship between the transit agency and those departments to be on the same page, because a lot of cases you can achieve some goals with moving traffic because you have more control over those traffic signals and be able to time them through different times of day, different flows in different directions. But definitely something to spend some time talking about how you want that laid out.
For anyone curious, here in Philly, we've done some TSP deployment, but one of the problems with it is that we often have near side bus stops. This isn't BRT related, but basically in our pilot studies we found that buses were stopping, calling for the green extension TSP, and then canceling the green extension. So doesn't work here as well as it does somewhere like New York, which has great savings with TSP. But I don't know if anyone knows if TSP is enabled for our Boulevard BRT-like systems, because I haven't worked on that, but I'm curious if anyone knows anything about
that. Guess not. Okay.
Jerome,
but yeah,
you've talked about the experience in Indianapolis. If you were to take a job in Chicago, which has a different density than Indianapolis, or even LA, which large megatropolis, but a different density than Chicago, what are some of if you were to put yourself in the seat there, what are the considerations that will be different than what you see in Indianapolis, number one? Number two, the sort of funding issue. And number three, this coordination between transit departments and the planners. It's, in the Transportation Authority. It's a big issue in Manhattan between the Department of Transportation, which is part of the city, coordinating their decisions with the MTA buses for BRT, and it devolves into finger pointing. So what are those are sort of three things that I'd like to hear your perspective on.
Yeah, great questions. In terms of dropping myself into a different city, that's Chicago, New York, Philadelphia. When it comes to the design aspects, I mean, more or less, a lot of those are similar. I will say, in Indianapolis, one thing we benefit from that's not quite the case in a city like New York or Philly or Boston is that we have very wide streets and we're dead flat. So, we have excess capacity on many of our roads downtown and further out that we can easily get rid of a lane or two and still have enough, whether or not the public believes that or not. But so that is definitely one difference is the actual physical geometric spaces you have on the street and parking considerations too. I mean, parking is a big thing. I didn't bring that up in design, but Different cities. Chicago in particular has a very notorious parking deal that they're kind of stuck with that prohibits their ability to do some things with the street. And I think Robert Madison is on in this session. He might be able to speak more about the situation in Chicago with the parking. But Chicago actually had a proposed BRT line called the Ashland Corridor, which was going to be very similar, center running BRT with center stations in that city. And that was going to be kind of a line that would sort of connect the spokes of the L rail system, kind of a north-south running line. And, it was going to be designed very similar, but some of the challenges they ran into there had to do with, if I understand correctly, one, not doing the most effective community engagement, but two, also the parking situation. For us here, we have a parking deal. We had to actually buy out the parking spaces that we took up, or we had to find places to move on-street paid parking that was on the street, move them to different locations. I think the biggest thing in the bigger, denser cities is really, it's just less space. But that comes down to talk with the different city departments coordinating with each other and really trying to get on the same page about being one sort of unified front of mobility. I think that there are beginning to be some examples of that around the country of cities and transit agencies working more closely together. I know Seattle has a good relationship, Seattle DOT and their different transit providers, King County Metro or Sound Transit, beginning to work better, closer together about what are the outcomes that they're trying to achieve. And I think that's really the questions that transit agencies and city DOTs need to be having with each other are, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to move people or cars or a combination of both, right? There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer, but that it needs to be contextualized in that it's not a silo. The transit agency just doesn't focus on transit. The, city DOT, it's not just streets and cars. I mean, it all has to work together. And I think the more those conversations are had and the more it's framed in people's minds that way, that it's all comprehensive network, that includes pedestrians and cyclists, deliveries. It all has to be thought of as kind of one thing, not these separate things. And then, there probably should be a conversation about prioritization. What kind of lives on what level? Where do pedestrians fall versus cars versus deliveries versus transit, and kind of looking at it through either a pyramid or however you want to think about it. But I definitely, those are the conversations that need to happen and kind of the framing around the conversation of transportation and mobility. I don't know if I answered all your questions.
Maybe the one that you sort of skipped over is some of the trade-offs with the funding. Where does this funding come from? How expensive it is per mile? Or, and do you do any sort of economic ROI?
Yeah, great questions. So this is going to vary depending on every city quite a bit. In terms of the funding and the type of project that you build. If it's more of a curb running, mixed traffic, BRT light or BRT creep, it's probably going to be cheaper because there aren't as many design, engineering considerations necessarily. But also there are going to be challenges. If you want more of a center running configuration, you've got to get utilities, and this would be the case for curbside or center. There's utility relocation and coordination. One of the things I did mention in terms of cost, if you're able to get a center configuration, having that one station versus having two stations, one for each direction, that does make a difference in cost. But in the case of getting funding, some cities, a lot of cities we've seen the last decade or so, a lot of cities doing transit referendums, as ways to generate more revenue for capital projects, more funding for capital projects and expansion, bus system redesigns. But it's going to be different in every location. Once again, there's not sort of a one size fits all answer to the funding question. But yeah, it's all very, very contextual based on where you are. Here in Indianapolis, we had a transit referendum in 2016 that we passed, and that's part of where the funding for some of our BRT. We're building 70 miles of BRT in the next 6 years or so. And so, you know, that's where our funding source is coming from. But I realize in some locations, you know, it's very hard to do a tax increase for transit or to advocate for that. Anybody else have perspectives on funding challenges? Nope.
I just wanted to echo the point you had about community engagement. I think about like Boston's experience trying to extend bus rapid transit. One notorious example, the 28X project. It had very little community engagement, and the community eventually rejected the plans because the perceived increased quality of transit in the area would raise housing prices and displace many people, or at least that's the community view. So I thought it's the most important part of this installation project. At least, I mean, I'm still learning, I'm just a student, but so far, all of the places I've interned, all of the classes I've had, that's key.
Absolutely, yeah. That is effective community engagement, which, you know, could be a whole conference or session by itself, is really important. And I think the biggest thing I can say there is to meet people where they are. Public meetings are not the most effective way to engage people. You know, you need to meet, especially with transit riders and maybe people that don't have the time to come to a public meeting. It's important to get on the ground, talk to people as they're traveling, meet them in places that they're already going to, whether it's a market or a festival or some, you know, neighborhood association meetings. But it's really important to get on the ground and go to the people. Don't expect people to come to you. Extremely important. Extremely important. And to the point about land value, TOD. You know, depending on the design of BRT, that can really influence what might happen around that corridor. You know, the center running configuration, there's been some preliminary kind of studies of this, but not enough information yet. But basically, the center running configuration has been viewed to be seen as more rail-like and therefore generates more likely to generate some type of better land value increase and trigger TOD. So that's definitely one thing to consider with the design of the project. And policy around land use. You know, I think any great transportation plan is also a land use plan. They should not be a separate conversation. And you can have effective TOD around bus rapid transit as well. So definitely important to have that conversation, because usually transit agencies aren't necessarily in control of the land around the project. Sometimes they are, or sometimes they have an influence, but that's definitely another conversation that transit agencies and cities should be having as well. Well, I think we're getting close to time here. Is this session supposed to end at 11? Was it 11:20, 11:30?
We're at 11:25.
11:25. Okay.
Does anybody have questions before I ask?
I have a question. Wait, are you hearing me? Okay. How does level boarding work on the BRT?
Yeah. So this we can get into a little minutia here, and this is kind of different in different cities as well. So there's like true level boarding and there's near level boarding, where near level is maybe a curb or platform that's raised about 9 inches or so, might not quite come up to the exact floor height of the bus, but it's better than stepping off of a normal curb height, which is give or take 6 inches or so. True level boarding, you know, those platforms are going to be anywhere from, it's going to vary on the city depending on the type of bus and what types of service they have. But in Indianapolis, our platforms are 15 inches high, and our buses, basically, the way it works in our system is we have these thing called carry fingers, which are these little kind of hard rubberized sort of edge fingers that are on the edge of the platforms that the bus gets sort of close to, doesn't actually rub up against. But we really train our drivers with kind of working on getting close to the stations and getting that appropriate distance, which is definitely difficult when implementing BRT because bus operators, for the most part, they've been trained not to hit a curb or not get too close, and now you're asking them to do something completely different. Get as close as possible. But the way it works there is that here in India is that we have these cherry fingers, and they sort of line up with the door openings and really provide kind of a minimal gap space. We try to shoot for 3 inches. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes it's further. On our buses, we actually have bridge plates, which are plates that can automatically deploy and kind of bridge the gap should the operator be too far away from the platform. And especially if someone's in a mobility device such as a wheelchair and they need to board, then those will definitely be deployed if they're not close enough. Other systems will use something called a rub rail, which is sort of a hard rubberized piece that will run all along the edge of the platform, and the bus can kind of bump up against that and keep a safe distance without actually hitting the concrete of the platform. Get a pretty close to the platform, or docking, as we call it. Other cities have something called a castle curb, which is sort of a kind of a curved. The way the curb is designed, it allows the tires to kind of get as close as possible to the platform without really rubbing up or bumping up against, to the point where it'd be scraping against the side of the bus. So those are all conversations that are going to be different in every city, depending on just the project design and who's designing it and best recommendations. I will say in Indianapolis, because we don't have a full rub rail, I think that's one of the regrets that we have. And I would definitely suggest best practice for BRT is use a rub rail configuration along your stations, because that's just going to make it easier for the operator. It's a little bit more foolproof, and it's okay if the bus, scrapes against that versus the concrete. So that would be my recommendation based on a lot of the studies that I've seen from other cities and the other experiences that we've heard from operations departments from many other transit agencies. Definitely rub rail, rub rail, rub rail. Any other questions or thoughts?
I just wanted to echo what some of the other people, particularly Chris said earlier about the need for coordination on transit signal priority. Because I know it's been our experience up here in Boston that everybody points everybody's finger at everyone except them. Especially in Boston, where you have the transit being run by a state agency running through multiple municipalities, all of whom argue over whose responsibility transit signal priority is. I think that's a relationship that's still in the early stages here, and we're seeing the downsides of it not being developed further.
Yeah, it's especially dealing with multiple jurisdictions that have different rules and different policies, that can make things rather complicated. And I think where, transit agencies can maybe take some leadership is to think of themselves as, sort of the mobility aggregator, that they're not just the transit agency, but they are kind of the ones that need to sort of take that role and responsibility, if they can, of really spearheading the conversation behind transportation policy within the city as a whole, and what the different various municipalities and departments are trying to work towards. Because, if you have a system that runs through multiple cities, multiple jurisdictions, it makes no sense to have a certain set of rules in one part and another set of rules here. And those conversations are challenging, but definitely need to happen. Well, that was pretty much, I think we covered some good ground. I really just wanted to, like I said, have a general conversation about BRT, some of the basic features, and just recommendations based on experience we've had here in Indianapolis, but also, how that might apply to other cities as well. I'm just curious, for those of you that are actually, is anybody actually in Philadelphia on the call here? And if so, what if any, conversations are happening there about BRT. I think you guys have kind of an existing BRT light line somewhere.
Yeah, we have a BRT deployment on the Roosevelt Boulevard, but they are making sure that they don't call it BRT for some reason. I don't exactly remember the reason why, but it's one of their marketing selling points.
For me, it gets confusing when it comes to people calling it BRT when people who know what BRT know it's not BRT. And I'm thinking earlier when somebody else mentioned BRT in New York City, I'm like, wait, when did New York City get BRT?
Yeah, the dilution of the brand of BRT, and I think that's something that we, especially in the United States, have done a disservice to. Just there's so many things that are called BRT, but once again, where is that line on what you actually consider BRT versus what's just enhanced local bus service that maybe should be the minimum standard for a regular bus anyway? Yeah, definitely a conversation to have. I'm not sure there's a definitive answer, but I definitely think some of the basic features we talked about earlier are a good indication of maybe there should be a basic minimum guidance from even Federal Transit Administration and about what is considered BRT in the United States. But I also think it's important to not silo everything or categorize everything too extreme, because we've seen some really great examples in Minneapolis, for example. They have the A line and the C line, which are what they call arterial BRT. Kind of have the features of BRT with near-level boarding, good station amenities, good frequency, but there are no dedicated lanes. I think there is some transit signal priority treatment, but basically those projects, I recommend looking them up. The A line and the C line by Metro Transit Minneapolis, they have increased ridership and they've decreased travel time in those corridors. And they're really effective for what they are. And for a frequent network of transit, and I think that those can be applied in different cities if the context is right. So the answer isn't always going to be let's build full-fledged single or center running dedicated lanes. That's the optimal situation, but I definitely think we should be careful that we don't block ourselves out from meaningful transit improvements that can be gained without necessarily building out all that infrastructure.
All right, Jerome, I think you've done an outstanding job. I learned a lot about what BRT is. Let's give him a sort of metaphorical round of applause. Thank you for his time. The value of transportation with these is great, and you brought it on.
All right, well, thank you.
Any parting words?
No, just buses are transit as well. I think there's sometimes people get really caught up on rail, but I think especially given our current reality with the COVID situation, we're seeing that buses have always sort of been the real workhorses of transit and carrying people that are absolutely essential now, and they were essential before, and they would continue to be essential afterwards. So just think we need to give some better love to our bus networks in every city, regardless of whether or not you have a robust rail system. Buses matter as well. So, thanks. Great. I really had fun this morning, and look forward to interacting with the rest of you throughout the day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jerome. Bye.